I want to welcome all of you to our, at the beginning of our monthly seminar series. It's the first seminar for the academic year. I want to welcome everyone in the room as well as people on the Zoom. I can be a poet, it's rhyming, room and Zoom for a change. But I don't think you are here to hear my poetry, but actually the speaker today. Just a couple of things about the seminar and the seminar series this year. It is an understatement to say that as a nation and as a people, we are going through a lot. And irrespective of what the politics are, this turmoil and the seemingly unending catastrophes, wars, conflicts, all these are making people question, is there an end in sight? And the question is, what do we do? What do I do as an individual as well as what do we do as a society? In fact, I was corresponding with a colleague of mine earlier who is working with tribal populations in Northwest on a chapter we are writing, and we were, both of us were commiserating with each other, and the things she is going through in the tribal communities as a result of funding cut and other developments. So I told her, okay, I will never complain, given what you're doing and what you're going through. So the question is, what do we do? So we thought a lot about it, and for this year, we felt that the science has a lot to offer us, particularly in the science of positive health. So what are people who are doing interesting work around these virtues to practice that could potentially help us cope, but not only cope with it, but also scale it up and share it with other people. So that was the intention. So we'll have a whole series of seminars this year. We'll have about 6 of them, where scientists are doing very important cutting-edge work on certain practices that can be cultivated to promote well-being despite whatever is happening. So I can't think of a more appropriate speaker than my colleague and friend, Dr. Victor Strecher, professor at the University of Michigan, to start off this year's seminars. I can spend, we are already behind because the class before us went up to 1 o'clock, so I don't want to take up too much time, and we have to end by 1:50 or so. So I will give an opportunity for Dr. Strecher to speak, but he's a professor of public health at the School of Public Health at Michigan, pioneered an entire area of research in tailored communications. We have one other person, Dr. Emmons, who has also done a lot of work in that area. But what is a strength of Dr. Strecher is he has been very comfortable with doing very rigorous, well-known, thoughtful academic work, very creative, but he has also been very entrepreneurial, trying to translate that science. And over time, he has been doing a lot of work on purpose in life. I have been following that, and also started a company around that. So I felt like he would be a great person to hear from, starting the series. There's a lot more. I'm not doing justice to his achievements, but Vic, I'll let you.
Thank you. Vic, thank you so much, and really thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. So we'll be talking about this topic, volatile political environment, wealth, but inequities, pandemics, fires, lots of things. We're actually talking about 2,000 years ago, 65 AD in Rome. All of that was happening in Rome at that time. And there's a guy named Lucilius. We don't know a lot about Lucilius, but he was probably an administrator somewhere in Rome, and he wrote to his life coach, Seneca. And he basically said, Seneca, I am going all over the place. I'm directionless. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I don't know how to make decisions anymore. the world is going crazy, basically. And that's what everybody was doing in Rome. And by the way, Seneca was a Stoic philosopher, but he was kind of one of the world's first life coaches. So he would write letters, and in fact, the letters of Seneca are fabulous and modern to read if you ever want to read them. But, you know, he basically was this person people would write, and he would write back. And this is what he said to Lucilius. As often as you wish to know what is to be avoided or what is to be sought, consider its relation to the supreme good, to the purpose of your whole life. For whatever we do ought to be in harmony with this. No man can set in order the details unless he has already set before himself the chief purpose of his life. He concludes then in this letter, if one does not know which port one is sailing to, no wind is the right wind. And we all know people who have a lot of wind in their sails, but no purpose, no direction. We call them annoying people because they're running around, oh, I want to do this, I want to do that, but they don't have a port. And what he's saying is obviously you need a purpose, you need a direction. And I would say it's very clear this is happening today in our world. This is especially now more than in my lifetime, I would say. And what I want to do and what I'd like to talk about is how we could have greater direction in our lives. And in doing that, have greater meaning in our lives. So there are a couple of questions I'd like to at least explore with you. I teach a whole course on this. I teach long workshops and that are days long. So I could do this for a long time. I'm really just carving out a 30,000-foot level in a lot of these areas, just to let you know. So my apologies if you're going, he didn't cover this thing. But I do want to talk about a definition real quick. What do we mean by this amorphous concept called purpose? And I think even if you're just here to ask, like, how do you study something as amorphous and difficult? You can't touch this. Well, we couldn't touch stress before. We couldn't touch social support before. We couldn't touch quality of life. I actually love trying to quantify the unquantifiable, and this has gone way off the deep end, when we talk about purpose in life, this existential concept. There are a lot of perspectives people take in regards to purpose, and I thought I might try to expand your thinking on a few of these perspectives, and that would relate to measurement. Since we're here in a school of public health, I think it's worth, at least for a brief period of time, talking about how we might measure this and how we might explore mechanisms for why purpose might be helpful to us in our lives. And just a bit, we'll touch on some outcomes. We'll focus most of the outcomes on mental health focused outcomes, even though we have done research on epigenetic clocks and people's purposes, longevity and people's purposes, Alzheimer's and people's purposes. There are 8 studies of that. I'm not getting into that. It's quite amazing, though, these results. And then can we build actual public health interventions? As Vish said, there are some, that's something that I love doing and getting into the real world if at all possible. So as a definition, I like Todd Kasdan's, he's a psychologist, his definition of purpose the best. It is a self-organizing framework for channeling energy and resources. In other words, the most important thing we have in our lives, vitality and energy, and those psychosocial resources toward meaningful goals. It helps us organize our goals. But really importantly, it is self-organizing. So when we think about this, and you might already be thinking, whoa, he must have used some AI for some of that. I did, and I used it from a 16th century wonderful silkscreen painter. And this beautiful painting is hermetically sealed in a museum in Tokyo. But I just simply took this little piece of it and started doing prompting using this as my prompt. So when you see some things, you might go, oh, yeah, it kind of looks a little bit like that. But if it wasn't hermetically sealed after all those centuries, it would do this. And we call that entropy, right? So in other words, things gradually get more and more disorganized, second law of thermodynamics. And what I would say, maybe one of the best, most fundamental definitions of purpose is that it's an entropy rebel. It's fighting entropy. It's saying, okay, and in fact, all life is, from an amoeba to a human being, is always fighting entropy. And it's doing it through some degree of self-organization. We'll be talking about human purpose, but amoebas have purpose, bacteria have purpose, etc. I hope that's making sense. So in the most fundamental level, we might argue that purpose is an essential element of life. It's that important. Now, there are different perspectives on purpose. We're in a school of public health, right? And we love in schools of public health to talk about death, don't we? We love to talk about morbidity and mortality and, death rates and who dies of what all the time. So, and people often argue, but, oh, we don't really do that. Yeah, what's the #1 journal in public health? Morbidity and Mortality Weekly. That's our premier journal. If you can't sleep at 3 in the morning, start reading this, you'll fall asleep. But, so this is a different perspective. This is more of a positive perspective because we're not actually caring so much whether you do live to be 100 or 120 or whether you get this disease or that disease. We care more about living a big life. As Mark Twain said, I don't care about dying, I care a lot about not living. And I think that's very, very important that we remind ourselves regularly that in public health, we're not just here to fight this guy off. Another perspective is that very often we take a look at the top of the trees. We take a look, if these trees are metaphors for humans, we may look at their behaviors or we may look at their diseases or their emotions from a top-down level because we're looking at large populations and that makes perfect sense. However, I really want to go further than that. I want to get to the root system, and that's what we'll be talking about today. We'll be talking about the root system of our lives, the things that may actually channel up to create our behaviors, to make us more resilient, to create our emotions. So I want to talk about that. We could even go further in perspective and say maybe we should have a reservoir perspective too. What feeds our identities? What feeds our core values? What feeds our purpose? And you might argue that in the past, our religion did, and even now for many people in the present, our religion does. Our communities do. Our government does. Our families do. But increasingly now, we might argue social media does. Influencers do. There are a lot of toxic elements, in my own opinion, that drop into this reservoir to start feeding new types of values because there are new sources. And as a result, we might end up becoming more depressed. Is that making sense? Okay, so I think you could easily study purpose from a reservoir perspective. In other words, what's feeding this? I also really like studying, and most of my work is studying purpose in this life domain perspective, because we all have life domains, and just to simplify it, we may say we have a family domain, we have a work domain, we have a personal domain, we have a community domain, and we study that. We can look over time at what happens in these domains across different generations, and we see, family gradually increases, Gen Z, not quite so much, but you see it's always at the top, that blue line. You see that personal growth domain. I want to do, find things more that allow me to grow. That's the green line, and that remains fairly stable. Work is pretty low when you just simply ask people to rank order these things. Work is pretty low, even though most of us spend most of our waking hours working. So I've been very interested in work purpose, and what a lot of people with my colleagues at the Ross Business School at Michigan, they have a Center for Positive Organizations, and they call this job crafting. Can you craft purpose from your job, from your work? It's very important because we spend a lot of time working and it really influences our lives, our health. So we could think about purpose from a life domain perspective because you could have a purpose around each of these potentially. Make sense? You could also think about a generational perspective. So this is John Adams' letter to Abigail Adams. John Adams was our second president. I believe he was a Bostonian, wasn't he? Yeah, so he wrote this letter. I must study politics, Abigail, and war, so that my sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. So my sons ought to study mathematics and philosophy, geography, natural history, naval architecture, navigation, blah, 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 in order to give their children, that third generation, a right to study painting and poetry and music and architecture. Isn't that an amazing quote? So many people still live to this. When we think generationally, all of you could think about the generation that did the heaviest lifting in your family, that allowed you to be here and now, right now. Because many of us are artists or poets, right? So just to kind of summarize that quickly, he's saying, to paraphrase, he's saying, I'm a soldier, so my son or daughter now can be an engineer, so that my son or daughter can be an artist. That's kind of cool. And notice the words he used. I must be this. Talk to an Uber driver who's working 12-hour days and 7 days a week so that his daughter will be the first person ever to go to college. He's doing the heavy lifting, right? I love asking Uber drivers, do you have a purpose? They'll very often point to the picture hanging from the mirror and say, that's my daughter, and that's my purpose. So they're saying, I must do this so that my daughter ought to go to Harvard Medical School, not the School of Public Health, School of Medicine, right? Right? So that her daughter has the right to go to the School of Public Health and to be a poet, right? Okay, so, and we laugh at that because there's an element of truth to it too, So, there's a lot of pressure for a lot of people to do something that their parents work so hard to give them, and that's a generational purpose, of course. Another perspective is a needs perspective. So a lot of people think that purpose is kind of on the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. After you have everything else, you've got your safety concerns, you've got your social concerns, you've got everything else, and then finally you say, oh yeah, maybe I'll think about a purpose. So I talked to a good friend of mine, James Aranateway, and asked him this: is purpose just for people who have everything else? James created Teach for Uganda. He was born in Uganda. He was a, quote, AIDS orphan, although he doesn't like to use that term, but both of his parents died of AIDS when he was about 5 years old. His grandmother took him to Kampala, walked literally 300 miles, bussed and walked, and asked the Prime Minister's wife for an education. Prime Minister's wife, after a month of waiting outside at the gates, said, finally, come on in, but not the grandma. James had to come in when he was this young little kid and convinced her to get an education, did get an education, a good one, and created Teach for Uganda, which started educating girls and boys, which in many African countries, as we know, in many countries around the world, is not acceptable. But he just went ahead and pushed this, which is wonderful. Great, by the way, Teach for Uganda, if you're ever looking for something to donate to, a charity. So James told me this. He said, purpose goes hand in hand with hope. Hope for their children, hope for a better life. In the West, you people may not relate to this. You may think it's at the top, it's at the bottom. And when you talk to people throughout the world in other countries about purpose, people are willing to die to have a purpose. They will do anything for a purpose. So, this idea that's at the top, I think that's a very Western notion, and it's an upper middle class notion. I do not believe this is, if you go out into the real world and learn how real people think, they need to have purpose. It's a drive. It's super important. By the way, when looking at the world, this comes from the World Values Survey that Shalom Schwartz created. How often do you think about your purpose? You see, it's pretty ubiquitous. China probably has the lowest level at 54% when thinking about meaning and purpose. This is often or sometimes. So, but this is another perspective, this idea of this hierarchy of needs. Then there's a virtue perspective, and I know you guys talk about virtue, and I want to really focus more attention on virtue. So, as you probably know, this is a David painting of Socrates. Plato is sitting over there. He's much older in this painting than he really was when Socrates drank the hemlock, and he famously said the unexamined life is not worth living. Anyone know who Socrates' most famous student was? We're at Harvard, right? We should know this. Plato, well done. Who said that? Nice. Well done. Okay, so who was Plato's most famous student? Anyone? Aristotle. Thank you. Very, very good. So we have Plato and Aristotle. And Aristotle, I'm paraphrasing, he said, yeah, Socrates said that unexamined life is not worth living, but he essentially in Nicomachean Ethics said, yeah, but the purposeless life isn't worth examining in the first place. So you have this wonderful two-sided coin. Examine your life, be a researcher of yourself, at the same time have a purpose and develop a purpose that you can research and build to build a more fulfilling, happier life, because that's what Plato and Aristotle talked about a lot. They talked about happiness, and they said there are kind of two forms of happiness. One we might call hedonia. You know about hedonism, right? So pleasure seeking, immediate pleasures. So, and we all love that. And Aristotle said, yes, of course, it's acceptable. We all love good food or good wine or good sex or good vacations or good whatever those things are. We love those things. That's great. But if that's all we are like, I'm quoting from Nicomachean Ethics, we're like grazing animals. And we all like to graze. But maybe that's not the only thing in life. We also need to be, Aristotle said, in touch with our inner daemon. Now, what's a daemon? That's the root word of eudaimonia. If you're familiar with happiness research, eudaimonia or eudaimonia, depending on who you ask, is a word that basically means being in touch with your inner daemon, which is considered almost an angel that went from the gods, that was the interlocutor between the gods and you. And keeping that daemon inside of you it turns out to be really important. In fact, Plato said this, keeping well ordered the daemon that lives within him, he must indeed be supremely happy. Okay, so how do we measure this stuff? Well, there's one famous measure that's used in the Health and Retirement Survey and many, 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 many other studies, and in a zillion journal articles. So when you look up PubMed Purpose in Life, you will get Carol Riff's Purpose in Life scale. And this has these items. I have a sense of direction and purpose in my life. Some people wander around aimlessly, though I'm not one of them. I don't have a good sense of what it is I'm trying to accomplish in life. You reverse that, of course. My daily activities often seem trivial, unimportant to me. You flip that around. I enjoy making plans for the future. I live life one day at a time and don't really think about the future. That's reversed. And I sometimes feel as if I've done all there is in life, and that's reversed. Now, this overall scale, as much as it's used, actually has pretty terrible reliability. In other words, these measures do not all correlate with one another as they're being assembled. That's not a good thing. Why? If you look at these last three, you start thinking, wait a second, if your plans for the future, you're not making plans, and sometimes you feel they're all, you've done everything, and you don't think about the future. Maybe you are old. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. You can still be old and have a purpose, but maybe not be thinking, oh man, I'm going to be around for a long time, so I'm thinking about the future for a long time. I think that's a real problem, and it's one of the reasons why we have this very low reliability. The other thing is this idea of I live one day at a time. Actually, many people think that's a good idea. I should be present. And there's a lot of debate and discussion in psychology, and about should I be present or should I be future-oriented? And the answer is both. You can integrate both of those things. But just thinking about the future, that's actually a very unhealthy thing to do. If all that's in your head, I can't wait to graduate. But you're not here in this class listening to me blab on, right? You're not here and now in that case. We want you to be here and now, but also have a future orientation. Is that making sense? Okay, that's typically what psychologists have been finding now. Here's my favorite Purpose in Life scale by Pat Hill at WashU, Washington University, and Anthony Burrow at Cornell. There's a direction in my life. My plans for the future match with my true interests and values. I know which direction I'm going to follow, and my life is guided by a set of clear commitments, my values, my goals, my priorities. In other words, I am also purposeful. I don't just have a purpose, but I'm actually purposeful. I'm aligning my life with these. Purpose helps me organize my goals, and now I'm purposeful in that I'm engaging. I hope that's making sense. And in order to engage, I better take care of myself. That's public health, right? One of my own purposes is to teach every one of my students as if they're my own child. Now that is a crazy purpose because I have hundreds of students taking my classes, and I go, wow, how do I do that? But if I think about that and I literally look out, take a breath before I start every class, and I don't tell them this, and I just go, you're all my child. And you have your parents sitting behind you going, I sure hope Vic teaches my son or daughter something. So in order to do that, though, I have to take care of myself. I try to sleep well. I try to eat well. I try to, I meditate every day. Things like that. So I try to take care of myself so that I have the energy and resources, getting back to Todd Cashin's definition, in order to devote it to being purposeful, to that purpose, aligning. Now, another way to think about measurement of purpose is, could you actually write your purpose down? Does that mean anything? Does that matter? Let me give you an example of a purpose. And this is from a colleague of mine at the Kellogg Eye Center at Michigan, who is a retinal surgeon. Out of the blue, he read my book and he sent me this email. I loved listening to your Life on Purpose book on Audible, and I have this book called Life on Purpose. I won't talk about it, but anyway, I just did. Since you seem to like to hear other people's purposes, I do. I'm very annoying in any Uber. I thought I would share it with you. To live each day in a state of presence from love rather than fear, so I can most effectively serve my family. Look at these domains. Treat my patients, serve my colleagues, teach others, contribute knowledge and perspective to my specialty, lift the disadvantaged in my community and throughout the world. That's powerful. To maintain my health so that I can help as many people. In other words, I have to stay healthy, not to live to be 130, but in order to engage in that purpose. That, to me, rather than scaring people about COVID, you might die, or scaring people about getting a mammogram, we can just get real practical here. Why not say, don't you want to be a good grandmother, a good mentor? You need to be alive, you need to be healthy because you have a purpose. Let's start at the root system rather than the top of the trees. 68% in research that we have done, 68% of people can find a purpose, can literally write it down. Many of those purposes look like Hallmark cards, but when we analyze them and compare it to happiness and depression using the PHQ-9, we find people who can write down a purpose are happier, and people who can write down a purpose are less depressed. So that's nice. There are different types of purposes. It turns out at least roughly half the people write about their family and their relationships. Others write about love and compassion. Others about their religion and their attachment to God. Neutral relationships with happiness, helping others, serving others. Maybe because they see how they could help, but they can't help as much as they would like sometimes. And they don't see the world doing this. So they're frustrated. Martin Luther King was depressed, and yet he had a super transcending purpose, obviously. Maybe it's because he could see the world as it should be and was frustrated that we weren't getting there, or getting there on time, or literally regressing. Growth and achievement, neutral. And then finally, lower relationships with happiness, success, and wealth. And that's really consistent across multiple studies. People who are super focused on hedonic purposes tend to be less happy. So they're saying, I want to be happy. I want to be rich and famous and attractive and blah, blah, blah. And it turns out they have less willpower when given a bowl of cookies and said, eat as many as you want, rate them in 8 minutes. They eat 8 cookies, crazy. But yeah, less willpower, and also all sorts of negative mental health issues. Respondents with multiple themes show the highest well-being scores, which is amazing. Want to look at mechanisms and outcomes real quick. When I think about these domains, I also naturally then start thinking about values, because within each of these, family, work, personal, or community, I might come up with certain values. And we use Shalom Schwartz's 16 values as we start examining the role of different kinds of values. And I work a lot with this woman, Emily Falk. She worked in my lab at Michigan for a long time under some of the P50 grants we were getting from NCI. Thanks to Vish, and which is great. Still appreciate that. And so it allowed us, these big center grants allowed us to bring in people from outside of public health. And she is a neuroscientist and she is studying values. And so we would put people in MRI and say, let's have you think about your core values. And when people thought about their core values, more blood flow went into a part of the brain right between our eyebrows, about a half an inch in, called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, or VMPFC. This is part of the prefrontal cortex. Humans have about 3 times more than the next closest animal. But this VMPFC is very special. It relates to these things, the self. When we ask people, who are you? What do you value? More blood flow goes there. Also, it's associated with future orientation. Can you imagine anything more important in public health than having a person with a future orientation? That's what we want to give people. Take this COVID shot and it may hurt for a while, right? But in the long term, you may not get COVID. Quit smoking now and you're going to be more nervous and stressed and gain some weight maybe, but at the same time, you're less likely to suffer some debilitating illness 20 years from now. We want people to have that future orientation, and that's why, if we could think about this almost as a muscle, could we work that muscle out a little bit more? It turns out that people with stronger purpose have more blood flow going there when we ask them to think about their core purposeful values, okay? It's also helpful in regulating emotion. So it turns out that the VMPFC is strongly connected to an ancient part of the brain. VMPFC is very modern, relatively modern, but you compare it to this ancient, what we call the reptile brain sometimes. Dinosaurs probably had it 150 million years ago, called the amygdala, 2 little almond-shaped nodes in the brain that are our fear center. And what we have found is and when I say we, our own research has found this, as well as many, many, many other scientists around the world. When we ask people to think about their core values, we see more blood flow going to this part of the brain, VMPFC, and we see less blood flow going to amygdala, this fear center. The fear center that causes anxiety, that could stimulate depression. So another person we work with is Ethan Cross, who runs the University of Michigan's Emotion and Self-Control Lab. He has a best-selling book right now called Shift, How to Manage Your Emotions So They Don't Manage You. He and I do a bunch of research together looking at purpose. And this is just one study that we've done looking at 1,666 people. And what we did is he has 16 different coping strategies. Notice one is drinking alcohol, another is venting, another is eating a lot. But another is seeing a big picture, knowing there's a silver lining, or finding humor, or taking a walk in nature. These are actually ordered, these coping strategies are ordered according to their strength of sense of purpose. So I've ordered them according to the sense of purpose. As purpose gets stronger, you see people are more likely to see a big picture, know there's a silver lining, know it won't last. In other words, their VMPFC is governing their amygdala. Whereas over here, it's literally negatively associated with drinking alcohol when you're stressed. Hope that's making sense? Okay, now let's map it to emotional self-regulation. So when we look at your ability to change your own emotional weather, you see that it maps almost perfectly. These are very different concepts. Purpose in life and emotional self-regulation, very different things. So we see that purpose is associated with these coping strategies. These coping strategies are associated with this emotional self-regulation. So these are things that might be the best, and they're used more often by purposeful people. Okay, I'm trying to get through because I know we're a little short on time. I'm going to 5 more minutes. Okay. Getting back to Seneca's message, as often as you wish to know what is to be avoided or what is to be sought, we're always facing that, right? What should I avoid? What should I seek? So that's always a problem. And when that happens, there's more blood flow, more activity. When we're conflicted between what to avoid and what to seek in what's called the dorsal anterior cingulate. This is, by the way, also part of our pain center, which is interesting. When we're conflicted, we literally can have physical pain. So that's right there in the middle. And my colleague Una Kang and I, who also works with Emily Falk now at Pennsylvania, Emily now has a gigantic lab at Penn, We found that people with a strong sense of purpose in life have less blood flow going there when we purposefully conflict them when they're in MRI. So we give them conflicting messages, but they know what to do. Just think about that. You know, you're tired, you've been working all day, you get home and say, I can't wait to have that glass of wine or that old fashioned, but you've got your kids, they're going, play with me, right? You're going, what do I do, which one? But if you have a purpose, which is to be an alcoholic, you'll drink more, right? If you have a purpose, which is to be a good father or mother or whatever, you know what to do. Make sense? Root system. Root system changes these behaviors. Finally, public health interventions. I don't have much time to do this, but I want to just start off with this technology adoption curve. How much time does it take to reach 100 million global users? Telephone, it took 90 years. Electricity, and this is only US data, 70 years. That's the only one with just US data. The car took 60 years. Mobile phones, 16 years. World Wide Web, 7 years. ChatGPT, 2 months. This is crazy scary and interesting, isn't it? This just came out recently in Harvard Business Review, actually in April, looking at what people are looking for in ChatGPT and other Gen AI large language models. Look at the top 3. Therapy, organizing my life. Remember, self-organizing. That's what purpose does. Third is actually finding my purpose. On LLMs, they're asking, like Claude, AI, what's my purpose? Help me find it. I have a course on Coursera around finding purpose. We now use AI. We have an AI, what's called a Socratic coach that interacts, and we now have over 300,000 people who are enrolled in that, which is very exciting. And in a week and a half, I'll be traveling throughout Asia in lots of countries to give literally 23 talks over 10 days in universities and companies for Coursera around finding purpose. It is a very popular subject around the world right now. And it makes me feel really good that we can reach that many people. The company that I founded called Kumanu has created this app called Purposeful. And so every morning you find out how you're feeling. Then there is a purpose coach. We also look at your core values. We break it down into an easy way to do that. This just came out this month by the AARP to 33 million AARP members. So we're now getting thousands of people, we're getting just tons and tons of users in this, which is really fun, and we're learning a lot about these people. So we're trying to have a public health impact. Ultimately, it's great. We now have an AI purpose coach that literally helps you find your purpose. 98% of people give it a thumbs up, which is great. We like that. It really does help inspire a purpose. And we hope that in inspiring that purpose, we will help people and kind of set the stage. In terms of AI, we all have mixed views about AI. We didn't ask for AI, did we? None of us in this room probably said, I wish we had artificial intelligence. And yet we do. And so the question is, will it just go poof? Many of us hope it'll just go poof, right? All the stuff it spews out, eventually, it'll just keep living off that spew, and gradually it'll get dumber and dumber, and it'll just go poof. Less than 10%, most experts say. The other thought is that as we're moving down the road of life, it will kill us. And it could well kill us, or it could kill our jobs. People think in terms of a singularity and we being controlled by robots, et cetera, about 10%, maybe a little more than that. It's very scary. And some great AI experts are extraordinarily nervous about this. You could also, though, think about AI as a potential force multiplier, a way to take all the boring stuff out of your life and actually help you. So in the last 2 minutes, I'm going to talk about just a couple of different kind of people. This is one example, a humanitarian, to protect and uplift those who can't protect themselves. Maybe running a refugee camp. What would they need? Well, resource optimization AI, predictive modeling AI, language translation AI, but also alignment with their purpose, making sure they maintain their health throughout this. An entrepreneur, an innovator, a maverick. My purpose to push boundaries, create breakthrough solutions that didn't exist before. What would she need? Creative prototyping AI, transdisciplinary synthesis AI, market trend prediction AI, but also purpose alignment. This person, my purpose is to use my personal growth and wisdom to guide others. This is a leader or a future leader. What kind of AI? Leadership coaching AI. All of these things exist, by the way. Sentiment analysis AI, global trend analysis, purpose alignment AI, always. In other words, when we talk about AI, there's so many different kinds of AI. We shouldn't think simplistically about this and just say AI is bad or going to kill us. There are so many different ways to think about AI, but I would argue that the first step is knowing who you are, knowing what your purpose is, your identity, what are your core values, how do you work, and on the basis of that, starting to create force multipliers that help you. So that's why I would say schools of public health, schools of anything nowadays, this is what I'll be talking about around the world throughout Asia, is we need to have that compendium of tools to help students learn more about the right kinds of AI that are relevant to their needs. Ultimately, I think, if you've ever been on Claude AI or ChatGPT, at the end it says, would you like some code written about this? Very often when I'm doing something, I go, yeah, but now there are 7 steps to take the code and put it on your smartphone right now. Here's an idea for anyone if you want to take it. I would say in the near future, rather than it saying, oh, would you like some code, it'd be kind of cool for it to say, who are you? Start asking about your core values, maybe about your purpose, maybe even helping you find a purpose, and then saying, let me help you as a life coach, as a Seneca, get to that harbor. And then after a couple of questions, it says, would you like a new app that's called the Vic app, the Vish app, the Karen app? Boom, it's now on your smartphone, just like that. And would you like to be connected with others like that? I see that happening, and not in the too distant future. So I'm going to stop there. I know I guess I went as long as I was intending to. We started late. So I'll stop there. Happy to answer any questions or if you have any in particular. Thanks.
We have a few minutes for questions.
Yeah, hi.
I enjoyed your talk. So I have a question about interventions. And, earlier you spoke about values and perhaps values affirmation as a way of...
It is, yeah, values affirmation is what we're talking about, yeah.
Purpose,
Yeah.
which I imagine would work for people who do have a clear set of values to affirm. The question is, if you could speak to what would go into an intervention that could help those who don't have a clear set of values work on developing.
Great question. Actually, values affirmation interventions and values affirmation and Claude Steele's approach to it is very interventional. Most of the studies are intervention studies, which I love. And most of those intervention studies have actually found the greatest effect among people who are poor or who don't have certain resources. Students who come in and don't feel like they belong in school are asked for 15 minutes to think about their best self-characteristics. A semester later, suddenly they've done better in GPA, whereas the control condition, they've done worse. So I think that you can prompt the idea of what are you like when you're at your best. If you keep it very academic and say, what are your values, that'll turn people off. But if you give people literal prompts, like, are you a good listener? Are you inspiring, et cetera? We do that in our app, actually, and you press multiple buttons, and on the basis of that, then we give you some indication in a radar chart of what we think you're like and people like you. Yeah, and that's worked in a pretty broad spectrum. But it's a great question. I don't have a perfect answer for that, but yeah. Yeah, hi.
Sorry, hi. Great talk.
Thank you.
Very much for it. I was wondering, actually, I feel that I at least, I think a lot about purpose and that.
Yeah.
And I feel that there is this natural contradiction of something that we want to normalize, like put some rules to it, or put some, some grounded ideas on how to actually find them or how to pursue them
Yeah.
with the individuality that it takes to actually have a purpose, right? And so, at the end of the day, I feel that there is this idea that in my mind seems a bit contradictory, and I don't know if you want to say something about it.
You're saying
In the idea of
you're bothered by that structured approach, you're saying, or?
I mean, it's not only a structured approach, which is a structured approach, but it's also something that is getting normalized because the data that is being fed into these sort of models is data that come from many people, and eventually we'll get an average of all of that, and
Yeah.
maybe it will normalize people into finding similar purposes instead of having a full diversity.
Yeah, and I wish we had another 10 minutes to talk about Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, who basically said we need to create our own purposes and not listen to what other people are saying. And he had a whole process that started with a metaphor of a camel, put everything on my back, metamorphosizes into a lion, defeats a dragon on every scale. It says, thou shalt, kills the dragon, then becomes a child. If you ever saw 2001 Space Odyssey, it's the star child at the very end, and they're literally playing Thus Spoke Zarathustra's Strauss, and that's in the book. Anyway, long story, but the whole idea of finding your individuated purpose is something incredibly special, very hard to do. It's almost like saying, I want to cook, and then suddenly you go in the kitchen and never cook and you blow up everything, And by the way, because Hitler had a purpose, Al-Qaeda had purposes, even transcending purpose. You have to be careful. This is, dangerous stuff. But you don't go into the kitchen and just start cooking. You read a cookbook. You read recipes. After a long period of time, you can become a chef. Very few people can become a chef, creating their own individuated purpose. Is that making sense? Yeah, but we'd have to have a cocktail to talk more about it, because I think I'm out of time.
Yeah.
Are there people waiting outside?
No, not yet. Maybe
Oh.
one more.
Okay, sorry, yeah. But I can talk afterwards, okay? Yeah.
Thank you. I was just wondering, for people who are, at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned, we're living sort of in stressful times, and if people feel that they have a personal purpose, how have you seen that be sort of impacted by feeling like that the world
How does
is
that
not
work? Yeah.
conducive to their purpose?
Great question. So there are a couple of therapies that are strongly related to purposeful thinking. The one I'll share with you is called acceptance and commitment therapy. So it's an extension of cognitive behavioral therapy, but it goes much further. Cognitive behavioral therapy is essentially trying to identify your stressors and take control of them, right, to some extent. There are other things, too, about thinking and processing stressful information. But in ACT, you say, if you have a strong purpose, a strong commitment to a set of goals, then it's better than trying to control all of your stressors. Controlling all your stressors, ACT people say, is almost like struggling to get out of quicksand. You just sink deeper. And I think we way too often struggle to control all the media. We listen to media all the time. We become, we're junkies to it. And we're going, oh my God, the world, oh, what do I do about it? And you're just really sinking. Not that you want to avoid it, but at the same time, being committed to a purpose, a set of goals, seems to be very helpful. And ACT has come out as being an incredibly powerful way to control depression, anxiety, and other things. Dialectic therapy as well is another one. So that's how it seems to work. And it's really controlling the amygdala. Okay. I guess that's all I have. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.